Hello everyone, welcome to this video and welcome to my spring reading wrap-up. This spring I read a total of 14 books and I thought it would be nice to close out the spring for this year, close out my favorite season by doing a reading wrap-up of all of the books that I've read this spring. Now, some of these books I have already given you my thoughts on, especially the ones that I read at the beginning. I think about the first 4 books on my list I have already given you my thoughts on in my wrap-up that I did at the end of March. So I'm not going to talk about them too much, but I do still want to give you some thoughts in case you don't want to go back and watch that video. I understand, there's a lot of videos on this YouTube place and you don't have time to watch them all. So, without further ado, we'll get straight into it, starting off with And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. My spring started off really well with this book. This book was excellent, and it definitely set me up for success with reading all of the rest of Agatha Christie's books, because now I just want to keep reading everything she wrote. Because her writing style is so compelling, and the stories are also so compelling, and so they keep you on the tip of your seat. The tip of your seat? Is that the edge of your seat? That's the one. Technically, if you don't let yourself get mystified by all of the options presented to you, you could figure out who the culprit is fairly early on in this book. And technically, I did have thoughts about the culprit and think, oh, but this person would be the most likely suspect in this case. And then I just let myself get distracted by all of the other suspects who seemed way more suspicious from that point onwards. But regardless, it's a really great book and makes me excited to read more of Agatha Christie's works in the future. And then my spring reading started off on a real high, and it took a steep nosedive with the next 2 books. The next 2 books are The Lifted Veil by George Eliot and This Side of Paradise by F. Scott Fitzgerald. I didn't like either of these books. The George Eliot book, to be quite honest with you, I have no idea what that story was supposed to be about. I read the story, I don't remember what happened in this book, and I don't really care to remember because I just know that I didn't enjoy it while I was reading it. And it kind of made me not want to read any of George Eliot's work ever again. But I have been informed that The Lifted Veil is nothing like George Eliot's other writings or the other works she published. So I still have hope, and I shall be returning to George Eliot, to the well of George Eliot, at some point in the future, and I will read either Silas Marner or Daniel Deronda, one of her shorter books. I can't get into Middlemarch right now. I can't. This Side of Paradise, same kind of thing. I do remember what happened in this story. I didn't like what happened in this story though. Or specifically, I didn't like the main character. I found the main character very uncompelling, meaning that you don't root for the main character, so it's not fun to read about him, and it's not fun to read about or to read the story because you're not rooting for the main character. In fact, I don't think there's a single character in this book that you want to root for, which makes this a really unenjoyable reading experience, which is sad because I'm sure that if Scott Fitzgerald wrote some really great books, I mean, Great Gatsby is really popular for a reason, because the public seem to think it's a really great book. But after having read The Side of Paradise, I'm not interested in reading any other F. Scott Fitzgerald books, because this was his first book and is also supposed to have been a great success and a really great book, and I just don't get it. To me, it's not a great book. So I'm going to put Fitzgerald to the very far side. On the other side of Paradise, the wrong side. That's where I'm putting him for the foreseeable. The next book I read was The Reunion by M.A. Hunter. I actually listened to this book as an audiobook, and I got onto this book because last year I listened to The Tenants by M.A. Hunter, and I really enjoyed it, and so I wanted to read other books by the same author, because when I find a book that I like, I would like to read more books by the same author that are in the same vein. Sadly, I was kind of disappointed by the reunion. I didn't really like it. I didn't really find the characters that compelling, and I don't know, I just didn't like the story that much. And I also read this book right at the beginning of April, so it's been a while since I read it, so I don't remember every thought that I had about it, but I remember that I didn't like it as much as The Tenants. Okay, the next book I read was The Book You Want Everyone You Love to Read by Philippa Perry. This book is a book about how we deal with conflicts within our relationships. And it was interesting, but this book falls into the trap that I think so many books in this specific genre of conflicts and interpersonal relationships fall into, in that it focuses very much, almost exclusively, on romantic relationships between you and your partner. And I think that it shouldn't. Obviously, it's important for you to be able to have conflicts, healthy conflicts with your partner, your romantic partner. But I also think that these books fall into the trap of only focusing on romantic relationships, when in fact I think they should focus on all types of relationships, including familial and friends, and maybe even just work colleague relationships or acquaintances. All kinds of relationships have conflicts. And if all of these books only ever talk to you about your romantic relationships, I think it's doing a disservice to the other relationships in your life. And it's also not really that helpful to people who are not in a romantic relationship. But, I mean, you could take the lessons that you learn from the examples given in romantic relationships and apply it to your other relationships. But the dynamic in relationships that are not romantic is different from the dynamic in a romantic relationship. So I think there's just different feelings involved. And so it's not helpful to try and apply rules of a romantic relationship to any other kind of relationship. So I would have loved if this book had more helpful tips for not only romantic relationships. Regardless, it was an interesting book, and there are some great takeaways in this book. I just wish it had encompassed more types of relationships than just romantic ones. Anyway, then next up I read I Know This to Be True by Greta, well, not by Greta Thunberg, by Jeff Blackwell and Ruth Hobday, but about interviews done with Greta Thunberg on the topic of I Know This to Be True, or in the series I Know This to Be True. It was an interesting book, but I think, or the book is comprised of 3 parts. A prologue, which is an extract of a speech that Greta Thunberg gave at some engagement where she spoke. Then there's the middle section, which is the actual interview that Jeff Blackwell did with Greta Thunberg and spoke to her about her upbringing and what got her into climate activism and those kinds of questions. And then the epilogue is another extract from a speech that she did. And having read No One Is Too Small to Make a Difference, I have already read the parts that make up the prologue and the epilogue of this book. And while the parts in the middle, the interview parts, were really interesting, I did not gain any new information, really, from this book. So it was an okay book. If you've never read anything about Greta Thunberg or any of the speeches that she's done or heard anything that she's spoken at, it might be an interesting book to you. To me, it was just more of what I had already read, sadly. Then, Next up, I read Big Swiss by Jen Beagin. I was really excited about this book for a really long time because ever since I first heard of this book, I thought it was a really interesting concept. However, I was slightly disappointed by this book. I think up to the midway point, about the midway point, maybe a little bit further than the midway point, I was really enjoying this book. And then after that point, I didn't enjoy it as much, really. There's a point where, if you've not read this book, I'm going to kind of spoil it for you. If you don't want to hear the spoilers, I will leave timestamps on the screen, and you can skip to that part where I won't be talking about this book anymore. And it won't be that long anyway. But there's a point at which Big Swiss and the transcriptionist actually meet. And from that point onwards, I felt like the book kind of just lost me. The part where they get into a relationship, or start having an affair rather, was the point where this book lost me. For some reason. I know that that's probably the part that a lot of people really liked about this book, but I thought it would have been a stronger book if they had not necessarily started a relationship with each other or started having an affair. But that's just my opinion. And there's clearly a lot of love for this book as it is from a lot of people. And I would kind of like to reread this book. I listened to this book as an audiobook. I would kind of like to reread it in physical form and see if that changes my mind. Just reading the book myself and going through it, I don't know, again, maybe it will change my mind, but I'm not sure. So I was kind of disappointed by this book because I was very excited about it. But maybe that was also just because my expectations were incorrect. I was expecting this book to be something that it was not. Witches, Witch Hunting and Women by Silvia Federici. I really enjoyed this book. I listened to it as an audiobook again. And this book is about the history of witch hunting and how witch hunting and sort of the persecution of women has resurfaced. Or, not resurfaced, it's never gone away, so, but become more exacerbated again in this modern era, and how economics and capitalism and the need for, capital gain has kind of been a very large part of what is making witch hunting and just violence against women and the persecution of women, making it rear its ugly head up again. This is a kind of summarization of a book that Silvia Federici has previously written or published in, I don't know, at least a decade ago, probably even longer than that ago. And so I would really like to read that book as well, because I think it will go deeper into the topics that this book explores. But I think as a jumping off point, this is a really great book. Moving straight along to The Sun Also Rises by Ernest Hemingway. After having read F. Scott Fitzgerald, I was very apprehensive to read Ernest Hemingway because they were contemporaries and they were also friends to some degree. And so I was afraid that they were going to be similar, or their writing styles and their stories, the kind of stories and the characters that they had in their stories were going to be similar. I was so glad to find that that was not the case. I really enjoyed The Sun Also Rises. There was a specific character that I didn't like, but I think he is supposed to be that unlikable character, and I think he is meant to be the character that you don't root for. But all of the other characters were really fun, and the storytelling and the writing style, or the kind of characters, also reminded me a little bit of Evelyn Waugh's writing, and I really love Evelyn Waugh. He's one of my favorite classic authors, even though I've only read one of his books. but I love his writing style, and I love his sense of humor and the way that he writes his characters. So I was really glad to find that Ernest Hemingway is sort of similar, a little bit, in that way. So I'm definitely going to be picking up another one of his books in the near or long-term, middle-term future. When, I can't tell you, but he's definitely on my list of would like to read this author again, which is a great thing, because I was so sad, I was so scared that this 26 classics in 2026 thing was going to backfire on me incredibly, and I was going to just be reading a lot of books that I didn't enjoy. Luckily, that is not the case. Most of the books that I have read this year, I have actually enjoyed. So, that's a great thing. The next book I read was The Greengage Summer by Rumer Godden. Yes. Wow. I was thinking of a completely different book because I read two books back to back with green in the title, and I was thinking of a completely different book. The Greengage Summer by Rumer Godden is about a family who takes a vacation to a hotel in France. A mother with her children. I don't remember if the father of the family has died or if he's just away for this point in time. I don't remember, but it is about what happens, or what the children get up to during this holiday in France, essentially. I thought it was a really interesting book. I did not expect it to take the turn that it did at the end, and I really don't want to spoil it for you, but there's a plot twist at the end that I did not see coming for the life of me, and it was really great. It was fabulous. The one thing I will say is there is a lot of French in this book, and it is most of the time sort of translated by one of the characters, because only one of the characters, one of the children, speaks French really well, so she does kind of have to translate for her siblings. But I feel it is not translated word for word. It's kind of the way that you would translate if you were speaking in a different language to someone and having to relay the conversation to a friend who's standing next to you who doesn't speak that language. You don't always relay everything word for word. You just give the gist. And I feel like we were given the gist of the French. And I do have some very small knowledge of French, so I was able to understand some of what was said contextually, just from a few words that I understood in a sentence. But I feel if I spoke French fluently, or at least more fluently than I do now, I would have had a better reading experience. The Frenchness of it all does not take away from the reading experience. I still think it is a really excellent story to read and fun to read, even if you don't speak French or understand any French. But it's just something to know when you're going into this book. The next book I read that was green, with green in the title, is The Green Kingdom by Cornelia Funke. She is a German author, and this book, she actually was the author who wrote the Inkheart series. I found out after having read this book and doing more research into her. That's what I found out. So she wrote the Inkheart series, or the Inkheart books. I don't know how many books there are in that series. And this book, The Green Kingdom, is a middle grade book about a young girl whose family decides to take a vacation to New York City. They come from, I don't remember where in the US, but they come from a small town in the US, and their family decides to take a summer vacation to New York City. Mostly because the father of the family has a job there. He is a construction worker, and he has to work on a construction site in New York. But also the mother has decided to take just random cooking classes because she wants to write a cookbook. That is her one big dream in life. And so the young girl is like sort of brought along against her will. She doesn't want to leave her friends for the summer. She's afraid that she won't have anything to do in New York City. She won't know anybody there. She won't make any new friends. She'll be lonely. It will be a sad summer. Sad girl summer for this little girl. Obviously that is not the case. She makes new friends almost immediately, and this was just a really lovely little read. A little lovely breath of fresh air. into my reading year. Sometimes it's really nice to just read a children's book and just let yourself be taken away by the whimsy and the magical imagination of children. Not to mention, it has one of the most beautiful covers I have ever seen, and I really loved it. And quite honestly, I read this as an ebook, but I would 100% purchase the paperback of this book because it has a beautiful cover, but also because I might read the story again. I might lend this book to friends at some point in the future to read, because I think it is a really sweet book. And I kind of want to read the Inkheart books now. I never read the books. I saw the film Inkheart, but I never read the books, and I kind of want to now. A Pale View of the Hills by Kazuo Ishiguro. I enjoyed this book, but oh my god, did it also confuse me. It confused the hell out of me because there's so much back and forth in time in this book between the present day and then one specific point in the main protagonist's history and another specific point in the protagonist's history, which are, I think, 2 different points in time. I'm pretty sure they're 2 different points in time, but sometimes I couldn't tell. I sometimes thought they might have also been happening at the same time, and then at the end of the book, I wondered if the woman was just having an imaginary dream and making all of this up, or whether the woman, the friend who the woman was supposedly talking about or having a memory of the past, was just herself in the past, and she had dissociated herself into a completely different person in her past life. So it was a confusing book, but a really interesting read and really interesting story. There is a film that has been made of it last year, and I'm really intrigued to see the film, to see if the film can help me understand better what the story is actually about. But I think I will just have to reread the book as well and make up my own mind about what is actually happening in this story. Because it's confusing, but it's also brilliant. Then the next book I read. I'm back on my Jane Austen train, everybody. I listened to Emma by Jane Austen as an audiobook. And let me tell you, so far, my least favourite Jane Austen. I'm not a fan of Emma. Emma Woodhouse just likes to stick her nose everywhere it doesn't belong, and I did not enjoy that. Still a great story. Obviously, it's Jane Austen. She writes great characters. She has great wit and, I don't know, a really great storytelling style. I just didn't vibe with the characters as much in this book as I have in her other 2 books that I've read. So, sadly, my least favourite Jane Austen so far. But nonetheless, one more Jane Austen under my belt this year. Then, the last book that I read this spring was A Different Kind of Power by Jacinda Ardern. This book was fabulous. Absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed it. It is about, obviously, Jacinda Ardern used to be the Prime Minister of New Zealand. And this book is a memoir of parts of her youth that led her to become active in politics or interested in politics, then how she became active in politics, how she became part of the Labour Party in New Zealand, and then her whole journey into becoming Prime Minister, even though she never thought she would or should be Prime Minister, or never wanted to be Prime Minister. She didn't think she was the right type of person to be Prime Minister, but I think she is the exact right type of person to be Prime Minister. And I think that if more people like Jacinda were in positions of power or leaders of countries, the world would be a far better place and we would have no wars. Or far less wars at least, and less just crazy people in positions of power. If more people in positions of power were like Jacinda Ardern, I genuinely believe the world would be a better place if all of them could just also be in power at the same time. That would be really great. That would have been the ideal, but I think this was a really great book. It gives the reader really great insight into Jacinda's motivations and what kind of obstacles people in power also have to face when they're in power. You know, it's not a dictatorship. Most countries don't live in a dictatorship anymore. Most countries are a democracy, and so even if you want to do the thing that you think is for the good of all the people, it also has to be agreed upon by the majority of all of the people in power to actually be able to be enforced. And sometimes those people don't all agree on the same thing. So it's hard to want to do the right thing or to do the thing that most of the public want to have happen, because not all of the people in power want to have that same thing happen. And I think her book shows that in a really great way, and I think it also gives an insight into what politics is like and the kind of sacrifices that people who are in politics have to make or choose to make, and just helps the common person who doesn't know much about politics and who doesn't know anyone who's in politics or have any insight into that world. Just helps you gain a little bit of insight and maybe have a bit of empathy for the fact that these jobs that these people are doing are actually really difficult and they cannot please everyone. It is literally impossible for them to please everyone. But regardless of that, they try to do the thing that they believe is the best for everyone. Or at least most of them do. Some of them just are on their own power trip and want to do crazy things just because they can. But I would like to believe that the majority of people in power are trying to do good things for the public. Maybe that makes me naive. Maybe all politicians are just corrupt. I don't know enough about politics to make these accusations, so I'm gonna shut up. Those are all of the books that I read in spring. So a really mixed bag this time around. Some books that I really liked, some books that I didn't like, some books that I thought were just okay. But regardless, I'm glad to have read all of these books, because now I have a few less books on my bookshelf staring at me that I haven't read yet, which is always a great thing. So, thank you all for being here. Thank you for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope maybe I have introduced you to some books that you might want to read if you haven't heard of them yet. Maybe I have put you off reading some books that you thought you wanted to read, but now, having heard my review, you think you have better things to do with your time, maybe, possibly. Anyway, thank you all for being here. I will see you all again next week with another video. Cheers.